that time.
And you got your chats? You got her still. Susan, I'm going to go.
All right. Happy Friday, everyone. Welcome to the 30th episode of Drumversations. Does it seem like it's been 30 weeks or so since I can't count this by COVID because we didn't start right at the beginning, but the fact that we've done 30 episodes and we've only done this since COVID has started is pretty startling and indicative of how the world has changed. But I'm happy you all are here. It's good to see you virtually in the house. We're going to talk about a lot of stuff today. First, we want to just take time to breathe and remember our ancestors. So breathe in. Breathe out. Breathe in. Breathe out. Breathe in love and strength. And out anxiety, worry, fear. Breathe in good vibes. Breathe out all the craziness around the election and everything else. I'm going to play the ancestral drum call and put your ancestors in the chat so we can honor them. We do this, again, to keep a sense of who we are in a context where a lot of the dialogue and psychological violence that comes at us through media and all that other kind of stuff seeks to take us out of ourselves. Remembering our ancestors helps us center and remember who we are. got some ancestors, Ashe.
Huron Cox,
Huron Cox, Ashe.
C. Cox,
C. Cox, Ashe.
Philip Lomax,
Philip Lomax, Ashe.
David Lomax,
David Lomax, Ashe.
Norma Thomas,
Norma Thomas, Ashe.
Frank Lomax Sr.,
Frank Lomax Sr., Ashe.
James Lomax.
James Lomax, Ashe. Ashe, oh, we honor all of our ancestors. Today, we're continuing the conversation about plans. The last couple of weeks, we were talking about Ice Cube's plan and how the contract with Black America was exactly that, a contract that really wasn't good for Black America. While on the surface, it had a lot of stuff that sounded good, when we dug deep into it, it really didn't seem to be something that was in our best interest. Today, I want to talk about, I thought I brought the book over here with me. Oh, it's right there. Dr. Chancellor Williams' thank you. Always good to have people on your team. Dr. Chancellor Williams' plan, what he calls his master plan, which is in his seminal text, Destruction of Black Civilization. And so we're going to give some context, let you know who he is, and then go into the plan. If you've not read it, if you have not read it, it's a book that's worth reading.
More ancestors.
We've got some more ancestors.
Amy St. Victor,
Amy St. Victor, Ashe.
Marie and Leroy Smith.
Marie and Leroy Smith, Ashe. Ashe. So here we are, less than a week before America decides whether it wants to return to the work of becoming a better country, or if it will continue its tantrum and reversion back to pre-civil rights era values with a healthy helping of authoritarian-esque fascism for the next 4 years. I haven't drank all my coffee yet. There's a lot of big words. It's in this context and that of a newly appointed Supreme Court member whose sole job it is, in my view at least, to work with the other orange appointees to ensure a path to ensure the path to a yet unrealized American democracy is rife with more and greater obstacles. This is the 30th episode, so that's the context in which we've been doing this work and having these conversations politically in the wider context of COVID, right? And so what we want to do is discuss in the next several weeks the work of scholars from the African-American, African-centered context who have done the work of outlining paths forward that align with what we've been discussing for the last few months with respect to a politics, or practicing and cultivating a politics of humanity. Today we'll be specifically talking about Dr. Chancellor Williams' master plan, which was originally published as chapter 15 of his text, The Destruction of Black Civilization, which was published by Third World Press in 1987. Our great scholar, by way of context, and ancestor, John Henry Clark, said that the book was a foundation and new approach to the history of our people. This book is not only urgently needed now, but it will be read by future generations. Here we are, future generations, still talking about this very important text. Another ancestor, an important thinker in the Afrocentric and African American or Black power context even, is Imamu Amiri Baraka, who said that this book should be the basis for all of the so-called Black studies programs. This is the basic text necessary for African mental development in the last part of the 20th century. So there are two very important thinkers and writers and scholars of African American history, excuse me, who not only lent their kind words to the support of this book, but recognized in the time of its publishing the importance of the text, right? In summation, Dr. Williams's text makes the argument that the central problem of Black America is unity, right? And like a lot of my work, we're going to use today in the next few weeks the micro context in the larger American context of Black America's approach to unifying ourselves and making the world better for us. But understand that because of the way history has worked, if we make things better for us, if we work together to make things better for Black America, then by extension, all of America gets better. How do I know that? Because the civil rights movement, the improvements in policy, procedures, and practices, and even what improved and evolved in the culture as a result of the civil rights movement has extended beyond Black America, right? So women, LGBTQ+, all kind of folks have benefited from the legislation that came out of the civil rights movement. In fact, there have been recent conversations about changing language in policies, changing language in laws as a result of the work that was done out of the civil rights movement, right? So making those improvements for Black America, while specific in some cases to Black America, will also have better impacts and effects, greater effects to all of America. It's along the lines of what Dr. John Powell at the Haas Institute at Stanford calls targeted universalism, right? Universalism, in his definition, means that everyone has needs and there are problems that are specific to everyone in the country, no matter who you are, what you look like, how you identify, all this other kind of stuff, right? And so in order to make the country better, we have to recognize what these needs are and do the work in community of meeting these needs. Now, the targeted part of the universalism means that while, yes, everyone has needs, not everyone has the same needs, right? And it's getting to that equitable context where, we might be neighbors in the same community and have similar circumstances, but there might be things that I need that you don't. And so therefore, the greater goal is to make sure both of our needs are met in the way that makes sense for our individual needs, right? Both of our needs are getting met, but they're getting met in an individualistic way that makes us better able to work together. Does that make sense? Targeted universalism. Universalism, everyone. Targeted means everyone gets what they need individually to be a better actor in the community, right? Okay, so targeted universalism, if you haven't checked it out, Dr. John Powell, check it out. It's really interesting. And it defines, or not defines, but it underlines a lot of the work that I do. Unity is the central argument in the book, The Destruction of Black Civilization. Now, here's what's interesting. He spends 14 chapters, Dr. Chancellor Williams does, correcting the misinformation of European scholars who have, created accounts, historical accounts, that are not quite true in order to justify things like slavery, imperialism, and racism. And what Chancellor Williams does in this book, he goes from 4,500 BC to 2000 AD, correcting the record, right? You see, it's not a very thick book, but it's very dense. He's not wasting any words, and he's getting right to the point of what the actual history is versus what, up until the point in 1987, we had been taught and continue to be taught now, which is why it's a very important book. Further, connecting some dots. We talked several months ago about Martin Luther King's I See the Promised Land speech. And a lot of what you're going to hear in Chancellor Williams's plan, his master plan in chapter 15 of this book, echoes what King said in that speech the day before he died. He said, essentially, the issue that we had to make sure that we addressed was unity, right? He named 5 things that were important. Unity. Dr. King said we had to maintain unity to prevent Pharaoh from turning us against each other. Dr. King also said that we have to keep the issue of injustice at the forefront, use what he called the transphysical power of love to bind us together and keep this work moving forward. and he said the transphysical power of love was a fire that no water can burn out. And we need to control our resources, he said. We need to build institutions and commit to the long game, right? It's generational work. So those are the things that Dr. King said. Unity, control our resources, build institutions, prepare for the long game, and use the trans-physical power of love as a way of binding us. So he talked about bricks and mortars, he talks about economics, he talks about culture, he talks about spirit, and he talks about long-term work, right? That was on April 3rd, 1968. By 1987, it was apparent that we didn't hear that, right? King was assassinated the very next day, April 4th, 1968. A lot of things happened between 1968 and 1987, including the crushing of the civil rights movement, the rise of the prison industrial complex, and the crack epidemic. And it's in this context that Dr. Chancellor Williams is writing this book, right? So who is Chancellor Williams? I'm giving you this context because whenever I talk about Chancellor Williams in this particular book, most people have never heard of him. So here's a bit of background. Chancellor Williams, according to blackpast.org, and you can find his bio in a lot of different places, but this was the most succinct description or example of his bio. Was born in Bennettsville, South Carolina, to a former slave. His father was a former slave, and his mother was a nurse and a cook. He was born December 22nd, 1898, and earned his undergraduate and master's degrees at Harvard. Not Harvard, Howard. I got to read my own handwriting. In 1943. He earned his PhD from American University in 1949. He also did postdoctorate research at Oxford University in London, the University of London, the University of Chicago, which at that time was the American Center of Anthropology, the University of Iowa, and the University College in Ghana, right? So this is a scholar. He wrote several important nonfiction text, but he also wrote a significant novel called The Raven, which was published in 1943. He worked as a Census Bureau worker, a statistician, a high school teacher, a principal. He was an entrepreneur. He was a baking company president, and he was a letter editor, and he taught in college. So, you know, in America, you can't always just be the scholar that you want to be. You have to eat. And so he did a lot to eat. And he had to do all of this work because he had 14 kids. Like, he was prolific in a lot of ways. Chancellor Williams was not messing around. I give this history to underscore the difference between the master plan as put forth by this well-respected scholar and African historian, as opposed to other such conversations being put forth by folks who are both somewhat less qualified and even folks who at times have qualified folks on their teams are not as really prepared for the depth and breadth of engaging the issues that face Black America. And this is a critique of the contract with Black America. It, like I said last week, is very narrowly defined in terms of economics and does not take into account any of the extra economic factors like culture, like trauma, like spiritual issues. It has nothing to do with any of that, and makes the argument that just by repairing in some kind of way our economic standing and enfranchising Black America economically, then all the other issues are gone, which is not true. Chancellor Williams does a fantastic job of really bringing to light the holistic nature of the issue and citing a path forward in just one chapter, which is not very long. That's the power of his prose. It's very succinct, and it's dense. So read this book, and you're going to have to take breaks after each chapter, maybe even after a paragraph, because it's just dense. But the information is necessary. I'm going to play some music, and then we'll get into what the plan is. Cool. So I was listening to Busta Rhymes' new record this morning, and he had Rakim on there. So I titled this section "Thinking of a Master Plan" because I'm corny like that, and Ruth is looking at me like you're so corny. All right. So here's basically what the master plan entails. I'm going to give you the context for the book and kind of go through the plan. Again, I encourage you to read it. It's really one of the better plans that we have. There are a lot of plans, but this is so well thought out, and it's so succinct, and it's so easy in theory to follow the steps that I think if we really decided to do the work together toward the end of creating a country and a world that is human-centered and balanced with the planet and the cosmos, this is absolutely one of the ways that we could do it, right? So after spending 14 full chapters setting the record straight on the history of Africa and how European scholars really distorted the massive contributions our people have made to the world prior to and as a rationale for colonization, Dr. Williams devotes the 15th and final chapter to a plan that functions as a framework, in his words, of a unifying organization to make the path forward crystal clear and based on the Sankofan perspective. And his argument here is that while even at that point, there were a lot of plans, right? There, and in the 40s through the 60s, there were all the Pan-Africanist conventions. There was the Niagara movement and the NAACP. I mean, there were all these events and all these activities happening from the beginning to even the end of the 20th century. But Dr. Williams says that the problem with a lot of the results of those events, activities, conferences, is that many of those plans were not steeped in historical fact, in a historical basis for who black people were, both in America and the diaspora, right? And by extension, I have seen a lot of plans in Columbus and around the country for things like eradicating poverty or, effectively ending homelessness that don't deal with the root causes of these issues, right? So if we look at a person in poverty and say, oh, you're poor because you don't have a job, and we get them a job, and then, we say we did our work, we're successful. And 6 months later, we wonder why that person left the job. It's because we didn't really understand the problem in the first place, right? And instead of doing the work of understanding the problem, we often and more typically blame the person for leaving the job that we got them. We got them a job. They didn't appreciate it. They left it. So it's their fault. It's not true in every case, right? Of course, there are always exceptions. But in most cases, the reason why the person left the job is because we didn't understand that poverty, quote unquote, meaning lack of resources, was only part of the problem, right? And what we've seen, to continue the metaphor of poverty in the context of this larger cultural shift, is that that person, because they were in an impoverished circumstance, they were accessing food resources on Friday, as an example, right? And so every Friday, they didn't go to work because they had to go get food for the week, right? It takes 2 weeks to get that first check a lot of times. And so how is this person eating before they get paid? They continue to do what worked for them before they got the job. And because we didn't understand the process of how to survive in an impoverished context, and we just took this middle class perspective and imposed it on this person, right? And said, we got your job, you're good, right? And we're not understanding how there are things that have to happen in order for this person to survive. And when those things disrupt the process of quote unquote middle class values, which is get up, go to work, earn your money, pay your bills, all that kind of stuff, then we think there's something wrong with that person. That's typically how issues of race, class, gender have been approached in terms of quote unquote solutions. And that's what Dr. Williams was highlighting. He says we have to have a foundation of who we were prior to slavery, prior to colonization, in order to create a path forward that takes us to a point of health, wealth, and even happiness, right? We cannot start with the problem and solve it that way. We, in terms of the manifestation of the problem, we have to start with the root causes. So that's why he spent 14 chapters really setting the record straight, right? And he says, we can use this framework, we can adjust it as necessary, but we have to start somewhere. And so he lays out this framework, right? He focuses on blacks in the U.S., particularly in this framework, because he sees us as being in the very best situation to lead as an example for the rest of the world, right? And I've heard that before from a lot of other scholars, a lot of other folks. Mainly because, and even King says this in his Promised Land speech, because as economies go, and we talked about this months ago around Juneteenth, at this time, well, in 1968, the black American economy had about $500 billion, which was the 9th or 10th largest economy in the world, right? As of the Juneteenth edition of Drumversations, black America had an economy of $1.3 trillion, which makes us still in the top 20, the 14th largest economy in the world, right? And so Dr. Chancellor Williams is arguing that we have the wherewithal to do a lot of things on our own if we just decide to do it, right? And that's true of the broader culture. We don't have to wait on DC to make choices that we can make for ourselves to begin to shift culture, right? There are things we can absolutely do regardless of how you engage this work of human development. There are choices that we can make right now. As Dr. King says, we can sign the dotted line of the emancipation of on our own hearts and have the accountability to ourselves and to our community to do our work. So that's why Chancellor Williams is focusing on black America. We are best positioned economically and otherwise to lead the rest of the African world, and by extension, the whole world, in the work of becoming healthy, happy, and whole. His very first point, though, is the one that everybody has the problem with. It is the creation of a type of governmental entity or an organizing entity that would act in and for the interests of all black Americans, right? And so his very first point is unity, and leveraging that unity to create an organization that functions as a governing body for all of black America, right? It would align our resources, it would increase our bargaining power, it would leverage our economic wealth, it would catalog and understand and address the critical issues that our people face in America, and by extension the diaspora, and it would have, as a result of that, the information and the economic leverage to then begin to create new neighborhoods, new approaches to education, new things that solve old problems. And I say new, and he infers new because what had been happening up until that point didn't work. Again, most of the quote-unquote solutions were not based in historic data and fact, right? Same as now. So you take this new knowledge, that means you create new solutions, new and better solutions. Far from being a separatist movement, he writes, this organization will be a cooperative organization in the fullest extent of that word, cooperative, on behalf of black America, because he argues that there's no reason to give up our 400-year investment in blood and labor to America without first getting a return on that investment, right? So America is a country made up of people that has not always supported, sustained, and developed its people humanely.
Unity will take time, but we must start the thing to achieve the thing.
Unity will take time, but we must start the thing to achieve the thing. Exactly. It's like a colleague said, I've been thinking about going to college, and I didn't want to go because it was going to take 3 years to finish the degree. That was 3 years ago. If I started then, I would have been done now, right? It's exactly that thing. It's probably the hardest aspect of any of this work, right? In my TED Talk about trust, I talk about the importance of trusting yourself before you can go trust others. And in finding others to trust, you leverage that trust to some action, which is active trust, right? Activating that trust. But you can't unite until you first have figured yourself out, right? And then once you figure yourself out, you find other people who figured themselves out, and then you find common ground upon which to unite. At this point, culturally, there are so many things that divide us in Black America, in America, period, that it's hard for us to find unity, right? So we have to do the work about being intentional about that self-work, self-development, and finding communities. He says, this was not a separatist experiment or ideal. He wants us to unite so we can be more engaged in the American project, more engaged in the world, but from a position of strength, right? He says this organization or even governing body would allow us to engage from a position of strength, giving us the requisite leverage to bring about many of the reforms we have been fighting for without the benefit of 44 million, and in today's numbers, 44 million people and $1.3 trillion behind them, meaning that there were, up until that point, so many people fighting in what he sees as not necessarily individual battles. King had SCLC, there was SNCC, there was CORE, there were the Black Panthers, Deacons for Defense. There were all these organizations, but his critique of the civil rights movement in that case is that the organizations did not combine to form one large organization. In this, I think it's interesting that from an Afrocentric perspective, Dr. Williams suggests that we can all do the work we do. We just have to do it in a way that's aligned at the macro level, right? And this is similar to how we've been working in Columbus to build a continuum of youth development. Every organization, every individual partner has a piece of the puzzle, right? And that piece is a viable, necessary piece. The part that's missing is connecting all the pieces in one puzzle, right? So what Dr. Williams is saying is this plan is a framework that essentially is the box of the puzzle that gives you the whole picture, right? And in each area, and we'll get to that, we'll delineate those areas later, but in each area of human beingness, there are already activities happening that need to find their place in that larger picture. And once we bring all of those things together, then the puzzle is complete, and we have in the puzzle what we see on the box. Does that make sense? So unity into what end? He's not saying that we should unite for the sake of uniting, right? We understand that there are, as I just outlined, some barriers to that. But he says, that many have said that we're not a monolith, and that's really our greatest strength. Our not being a monolith means that we have a diversity of talent, resources, experiences, and perspectives that make our ability to function successful. No country could be successful if everyone was the same. No corporation can be successful if everyone is the same. No neighborhood would be cool to live in if everybody was the same. That would be the Twilight Zone, right? So the idea is leveraging, understanding everything we bring to the table and putting it in a place to be leveraged for the good of all, right? Not just individuals. The unifying principle, as King said in I See the Promised Land speech, is justice, right? King admonished us to focus on justice and to control our resources, right? With a focus on justice as unifying principle, we can figure out how to direct our over 1.3 trillion in ways that build our own institutions, schools, businesses, communities, and the like, and infrastructure. Dr. Williams writes that economic development activities are the actual survival activities that provide the means by which we exist, right? So in order to have what we need to be healthy, happy, and whole, we have to come together and build it, right? If you think about even the country, there were civilizations like various nations that existed before America, and they operated wonderfully. There was no such thing as America before the 18th century, right? But all the stuff that happened to create America aside, in terms of the atrocities, the genocides, and everything like that, because there was no America, someone had to have the idea, and that someone was not just one person, but the idea had to generate itself in some kind of way in many people who then had a conversation. That conversation led to action. That action led to the first brick being built or being put down in the soil, which then led to the country, right? And those bricks in that case were the founding documents, right? It codified these ideas, and then from those ideas and ideals, systems and institutions were built that then became America, right? That's how anything happens, whether it's formal or informal. There's an idea, there's agreement, right? There's the writing of the plan, business plan, what have you, and then there's the work that makes those things real. And that's really what Chancellor Williams is arguing as our first step in creating an organizational principle that then institution can be built around that then governs how we move forward, right? But we cannot do that without unification. How? He says, by creating and scaling enterprises that are owned and operated by the people, this organizational principle can help us formalize the practice of Ujima, the collective economics, right? In the spirit of African socialism, the community would own and operate and benefit from profit sharing as shareholders. The people would elect folks to manage the company and all that kind of stuff and deal with the day-to-day operations, and would gain the resources from them. And with those resources, they could do the work of building, right? But again, the organizing principle has to be justice. In order to get justice, we cannot ask or demand it from some people, from the people who have not historically given it to us. So we take it by organizing and doing a lot of the work that we can do on our own, right? This is the same on November 4th. Whomever becomes president, there's still work that we're going to have to do on our own to make sure our communities are healthy, happy, and whole, right? Like I said, it's macro, micro, right? Because we are only 13.5% of America, talking about Black American unity is a microcosm of what needs to happen in the larger political and cultural landscape. But again, we were here before everybody else. Before there was a Europe, before there was a Asia, before there was a India, before there was America, there were city-states in Africa, right? The Sudan, Kush, ancient Kemet, down in central southern Africa, they found ruins that are hundreds of thousands, like literally over 100,000 years old. So we've done this before. Reading this book helps us remember that and gives us a pathway to unite and be an example for the country and the rest of the world. I'm going to play something else, and then we talk about how we start. Yeah.
Ancestors.
Oh, we got more ancestors.
Ed Bell.
Ed Bell, Ashe.
Edna Bell.
Edna Bell, Ashe.
Charles Bell.
Charles Bell, Ashe.
William Bell.
William Bell, Ashe.
George Bell.
George Bell, Ashe.
Mike Bell.
Mike Bell, Ashe.
Patricia Bell.
Patricia Bell, Ashe.
Danielle Bell.
Danielle Bell, Ashe.
And Larry Baker Jr.
Larry Baker Jr., Ashe. I will say before I play that he spends a lot of time, Dr. Williams does, talking about unity and this organizing principle and body, because it absolutely is the most difficult thing to do. But it's only difficult because we've been socialized in a way that we think we cannot organize because we're so different. Right, but Ruth and I were talking about this morning that genetically we are actually more alike, human beings are, than tsetse flies, fruit flies, right? Fruit flies have more genetic variation than we do as human beings, and that's insane because we have more genes, right? So we are absolutely fundamentally more alike than we are different, right? And even within Black America, we fundamentally experience the world in a similar way, regardless of our class differentials, regardless of our educational differentials, regardless of our different views on religion, right? Malcolm X said in his Ballad of the Bullet speech that they're not killing black people because they're Christian. They're not killing black people because they're Muslim. They're killing them because they're black. The same is true of police officers and police brutality, right? They're not stopping to check to see if you're a millionaire. They're not stopping to check to see if you have a doctorate degree. They don't care what church you go to, right? So this false notion in Black America and America at large that we are so different is exactly the thing that's being, the tool, divide and conquer, that's being used to keep the elite in power in a way that continues to extract resources and keep this country from being great, right? It keeps Black America from healing because we're so worried about how we're different or better than everybody else, like within our own community. It's not about that, right? It's about our experience as human beings. It's about our experience as Black human beings in the United States. That should be enough to unite us so we can go do this work. I'm gonna play and we'll talk about the how. Solid. So how do we start? Every time you talk about a plan, everybody's like, well, that sounds great. That sounds great. But what do we do first? What do we do first? And so we talked about the first idea that needs to be conquered. And the first thing that needs to happen is organization. But why can't we organize? It's because we've been socialized a certain way. And Dr. Chancellor Williams, in his infinite wisdom, understood that. So he literally has a section that says, how do we start? And he says that we begin by liberating our minds. Like, that's the thing. So, you know, when we look at the Contract for Black America, there was nothing about the mental trauma and the psychological issues that we faced as a result of slavery. It's just like, give them money and then the rest is their problem, right? That doesn't make any sense. Here's an actual scholar, somebody who's put time, thought, and research into the social, political, cultural, and spiritual issues that face Black America. And again, Black America is a microcosm to all of America. So if we have these issues, everybody has these issues. So if we figure out how to solve them, we literally can lead the country and the world into a new space. That's why these conversations are so important. So he says we need to liberate our minds. We have to first decolonize our minds in order to fully act in our own interest without fear of unintentional sabotage, because our programming subconsciously works against us, right? We each have to make the decision to be free, to connect with other like-minded individuals and get to work. Dr. Williams outlines a plan of action step by step, and he's divided he's outlined various areas of focus. There are 8 areas of focus. The first is economic planning and development, right? He spent time talking about that organization or governing body. Once we are united, the very first act of that body is to coordinate our economic resources in our interests, so we can build schools, so we can build our own businesses, so we can do these things to help our communities, right? And just as an aside, I know that there are books like Mersha Bauer-Duran's The Color of Money and some other books that show why historically, because of federal policy, Black banking and other such financial institutions don't go all of the way that a lot of people think they should in elevating Black wealth, right? But Chancellor Williams is not making the argument that we create Black businesses, Black banks that only serve Black people. Remember, it is not a separatist agenda. It's an agenda that says we need to unify our resources so we can now negotiate, navigate these wider spaces across the planet as a united bloc, right? So we're not hemmed in by policy, procedures, and practices that have historically kept us from generating the resources we need to do what we need to do. That's a very important point. So the first area of focus is economic planning and development. The second is political action. The third is public education. The fourth is community services. The fifth is youth activities. The sixth is Pan-African affairs, uniting the diaspora. The seventh is intelligence and security, because you know there are going to be a lot of folks and entities that are against this work. And the fifth is spiritual activities and growth. So here in the eighth is spirituality and growth. In 8 areas of focus, Dr. Williams captures the majority, if not all, of the various things that need to be engaged as a body of people begin to create the resources and the wherewithal to shift their own destiny. Remember, Dr. Wade Noble says the essence of power is the ability to define reality for yourself and others and engage those others in that reality as if it's a reality of their own choosing. And in order to do that, we have to take back our agency. We have to do the work we need to do to create the environments that work for us, right? All of this would ideally be held together by what Dr. Williams calls the ideology of Black Africanism, right? Operating within the framework of the traditional African philosophy of life, and then the best of the African traditional value system. So he's kind of calling back to Julius Nyerere, the first president of Tanzania, and his work on African socialism and African-centered economic approaches, right? The idea of African socialism is fundamentally everyone is human and is to be treated humanely, which means basic needs are met as a matter of course, right? And then once that is taken care of, everybody then is accountable to the whole. So now, because the whole is meeting my needs, my role within the context of the whole is to add value to the whole to meet the needs of all, right? It's a different value proposition. It's not just about extracting resources. It's about adding resources, and then what you get from your addition is what you need, right? Again, in the more traditional living context, after rites of passage in a particular village, the whole village or the men or however is separated or broken down in terms of labor, everyone helps to build homes for the young people. Those young people not only get their own homes, they get their own plot of land that they are supposed to work. They work that land, they cultivate that land, and whatever the harvest is that is beyond what they need is given back to the whole. And so nobody goes hungry, nobody is homeless, and nobody is impoverished in the way that we understand poverty, right? This is what happens when you begin to shift your perspective from this colonized, and I don't mean that in the sense of black and white. Colonized mind in this context, I'm expanding what Dr. Williams is saying, is the sense that we can only do things that benefit ourselves individually, right? We have all been socialized that way. What happens if we begin to look at our abilities, our talents, in a more communal way, in a more humane way, which means what can I do for the people in order to make my community better, which means then I will have what I need because my community is doing what it's supposed to do, right? Whole different cultural shift and shift of perspective. So in a nutshell, we have gone through chapter 15 of the destruction of black civilization. I implore you to read the first 14 chapters. And we didn't even get to everything, but what he does in the rest of chapter 15 is further break down, what these focus areas do, their purpose statements, how you can divide the labor and bring about this change for Black America. This is a plan that makes sense for us because it's rooted and grounded in our history before slavery. It is not just economics, it's cultural, it's spiritual, it's educational, it's everything. That's what makes this a plan that's healthy and humane for us and for everyone else. Have a great week. Have a great weekend. See you next week.